Deep in Whisper Valley, where morning mist clings to weathered barns and gossip travels faster than wildfire, stood the old Morrison house. 2 stories of rotting wood and broken dreams that had claimed 3 families in 20 years. The day 26-year-old Brian Torres walked up that crumbling porch with cash in hand, the entire valley held its breath. They saw a mountain kid with dirt under his fingernails and patches on his jacket. They had no idea they were looking at a man who'd spent 15 years learning ancient building techniques from his grandfather, a master craftsman who'd helped construct some of the world's most incredible hidden structures. While neighbors whispered about his foolishness, Brian began tearing away decades of neglect, revealing hand-carved beams and intricate stonework that shouldn't exist in a simple farmhouse. But, as his renovation progressed, something extraordinary emerged, something that would transform not just a house, but an entire community's understanding of what was possible. What secret was buried in those walls that would leave the valley speechless? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after the purchase, Brian stood in what remained of the front yard, studying the house through eyes that had been trained to see beyond surface decay. Where others saw rot and ruin, he recognized the telltale signs of master craftsmanship hidden beneath layers of neglect. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, "Mijo, the bones of a building never lie. They tell stories that the living have forgotten." Martha Henderson from the neighboring farm watched him through her kitchen window, coffee mug trembling in her weathered hands. She'd lived beside that cursed property for 47 years, had watched the Morrisons flee in 1978, the Blackwoods abandon it in 1985, and the Jenkins family pack their belongings in the dead of night just 3 years ago. Each family had arrived with hope and left with haunted eyes, speaking in whispers about strange sounds in the walls and rooms that seemed to shift when no one was looking. Brian began methodically, starting with the sagging front porch. As he pried away rotted planks, his calloused fingers detected something unusual beneath: stone foundations that extended far deeper than any farmhouse required. The stonework bore carved symbols that made his breath catch. He'd seen similar markings only once before, in the hidden chambers his grandfather had shown him deep in the Cascade Mountains. By noon, a small crowd had gathered at the property line. Tom Briggs, who ran the hardware store, shook his head as Brian carefully extracted each damaged board instead of simply demolishing everything. "Boy's gonna be at this for years," Tom muttered to anyone who'd listen. "Should have just torn the whole thing down and started fresh." But Brian wasn't interested in starting fresh. As afternoon shadows lengthened, he discovered his first major revelation. Behind a wall of cheap paneling installed sometime in the 1960s lay a section of hand-hewn timber joints that belonged in a medieval cathedral, not a rural farmhouse. The precision of the cuts, the complexity of the joinery, it spoke of knowledge that had been passed down through generations of master builders. Eleanor Vasquez, the valley's unofficial historian, couldn't resist approaching as Brian worked. At 83, she remembered more about Whisper Valley than anyone alive, yet she'd never seen craftsmanship like what was emerging from that house. "Young man," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of age, "my great-grandfather helped build half the structures in this valley. He never mentioned anything like this." Brian looked up from his work, sweat glistening on his dark skin despite the cool mountain air. "Sometimes the most important work is done in secret, Senora. My grandfather taught me that the best craftsmen leave their true masterpieces hidden." As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, Brian made a discovery that would haunt his dreams and fuel weeks of obsessive investigation. While removing a section of interior wall, his crowbar struck something metallic. Behind the plaster and lath, embedded in the original timber frame, was a small bronze plate covered in intricate engravings. The symbols were unlike anything he'd encountered, yet they felt familiar in a way that made his skin prickle. The plate was warm to the touch, warmer than the surrounding wood had any right to be after decades of abandonment. As his fingers traced the raised symbols, he could swear he felt a subtle vibration, as if the very walls were alive with some dormant energy waiting to be awakened. That evening, as Brian sat on a makeshift stool in what had once been the living room, the bronze plate resting on his knee, he understood that he'd stumbled onto something far more significant than a renovation project. The Morrison house wasn't just a cursed property. It was a puzzle that had been waiting over a century for someone with the right knowledge to solve it. Outside, the valley settled into its familiar evening rhythm, unaware that everything they thought they knew about their quiet community was about to change forever. The morning after Elias Thorne's visit to the bank, Margaret Clearwater found herself standing at her kitchen window, coffee growing cold in her hands as she stared across the valley toward the Blackwood property. From her elevated position on Maple Street, she could see the skeletal remains of what had once been the valley's crown jewel, a sprawling Victorian mansion that now looked like broken teeth against the mountain backdrop. She wasn't the only one watching. Throughout Millbrook, conversations in every diner booth and shop counter circled back to the same incredulous topic: someone had actually bought the cursed land. By noon, 3 different versions of Elias Thorne's appearance had spread through town, each more elaborate than the last. Some said he was tall as a basketball player, others claimed he was compact and wiry. Everyone agreed on his unusual green eyes and the unsettling way he seemed to listen to things no one else could hear. Margaret had lived in Millbrook for 67 years, long enough to remember when the Blackwood estate was the social center of the valley. The original owners, a railroad family, had hosted elaborate parties where ladies in silk gowns danced under crystal chandeliers, while men in evening wear discussed business deals that shaped the region's future. That was before the accident started. First came the fire in 1962 that claimed the East Wing, 2 members of the household staff. Then the mining accident in 1968 that killed the Blackwood heir just months before his wedding. A series of financial disasters followed, each more devastating than the last, until the family abandoned the property in 1975. Since then, 7 different owners had tried to restore the estate. 7 different owners had fled within 2 years, citing everything from structural nightmares to unexplained phenomena that drove grown men to pack their belongings in the middle of the night. The locals had theories, of course. Some blamed the location, built too close to old mining tunnels that created unstable ground and strange acoustics. Others whispered about Native American burial grounds, though no one could produce evidence of such claims. Margaret favored the practical explanation. The house was simply too ambitious a project for anyone's budget or patience. But she couldn't deny the pattern was unsettling. Now, this Elias Thorne thought he could succeed where everyone else had failed. Around 3 o'clock, Margaret's curiosity overcame her better judgment. She drove to the end of Blackwood Road, where the paved surface gave way to a rutted dirt track that wound through dense pine forest toward the estate. She parked at the rusted gate, noting that someone had recently forced it open. The chain that had secured it for months lay coiled in the weeds like a discarded snake. Walking up the overgrown drive, Margaret felt the familiar chill that always accompanied visits to this place. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as she moved deeper into the property's shadow. Ancient oaks formed a canopy so thick that afternoon sunlight barely penetrated, creating an premature twilight that made her wish she'd brought a flashlight. The mansion peered through the trees like a mirage of former grandeur. 3 stories of weathered stone and warped timber rose from a foundation of cracked granite blocks. Windows gaped like empty eye sockets, their glass long since shattered by weather and vandals. Ivy had claimed the south wall, its tendrils reaching toward the partially collapsed roof where ravens had built their nests. But something was different. Margaret stopped short when she noticed fresh tire tracks in the muddy drive, deep grooves from a heavy vehicle. Moving closer to the house, she saw other signs of recent activity: stacks of lumber covered by blue tarps, coils of electrical wire, and what appeared to be surveying equipment positioned around the property's perimeter. A sound from inside the house made her freeze. Footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, moving across what she remembered as the main hall. Then a voice, though she couldn't make out words. Margaret crept closer, her practical shoes crunching on broken glass and fallen leaves. Through a gap in the boarded-up front entrance, she glimpsed movement. A tall figure in work clothes moved with surprising confidence through the dim interior, speaking to someone she couldn't see. The voice was Elias Thorne's. She recognized the careful cadence from their brief encounter at the bank. But who was he talking to? "The foundation is more solid than it appears," his voice carried through the broken doorway. "We can work with this." Margaret pressed closer, straining to hear a response from his companion. Instead, she heard only Thorne's voice continuing the conversation, as if listening to replies only he could perceive. "Yes, I understand the challenges, but I've dealt with similar situations before." A chill ran down Margaret's spine that had nothing to do with the perpetual shade surrounding the house. She backed away slowly, gravel crunching under her feet with each careful step. Whatever Elias Thorne was doing at the Blackwood estate, he wasn't doing it alone, even if his companions remained invisible to everyone else. The whispers started before dawn. What she saw made her drop her mug. Lights. Not the flickering, sputtering kind that had occasionally appeared over the years, ghost lights, the children called them. These were steady, warm, and coming from windows that hadn't held glass in decades. By 7 o'clock, half the town had gathered at Murphy's General Store, their morning routines abandoned in favor of urgent speculation. Tom Rodriguez clutched a pair of binoculars he'd retrieved from his truck, while elderly Mrs. Chen kept muttering prayers in Mandarin. "I'm telling you, there's smoke coming from the chimney," Tom insisted, adjusting the binoculars. "Real smoke, not that green stuff we used to see." "Impossible," Martha declared, though her voice wavered. "That place has been dead for 30 years. The chimney's probably collapsed." "Then explain the lights," Tom challenged. Nobody could. The mysterious young man, Elias, Martha recalled from yesterday's encounter, had vanished after his visit to the bank. His truck was gone, and Mayor Caldwell had spent the evening fielding increasingly frantic phone calls from residents demanding answers he didn't have. "Maybe he's some kind of developer," suggested Jenny Walsh, bouncing her toddler on her hip. "You know, planning to tear everything down and build condos." "With what crew?" Tom lowered his binoculars. "Nobody from around here would set foot on that property after dark. Hell, most won't go there in broad daylight." Mrs. Chen's prayers grew more urgent. The debate might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of Danny Morrison, the valley's mail carrier. Danny's route took him along the old mountain road that skirted the Blackwood property, and his face was pale as fresh snow. "I saw him," Danny announced, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. "The buyer. He was working in the garden." The gathering fell silent. "What garden?" Martha asked carefully. "Behind the main house, where the old herb garden used to be before—" Danny swallowed hard. "Before Sarah Blackwood died, there were plants growing, green plants, and he was tending them like it was the most natural thing in the world." Tom raised his binoculars again, scanning the distant property. "I don't see any garden, just the same dead ground that's been there for decades." "It was there," Danny insisted. "And there was something else. The house looked different, cleaner, like someone had been fixing it up, but that's impossible. It would take months, maybe years, to repair that kind of damage." The skeptical murmurs that followed were interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Patricia Kane. Her patrol car pulled up with deliberate slowness, and she emerged with the measured movements of someone trying to project calm while feeling anything but. "Morning, folks," she said, though her eyes were fixed on the distant property. "I suppose you're all here about the lights." "You saw them too?" Martha asked. Patricia nodded grimly. "Got 3 separate calls about them before midnight. Figured I'd better take a look for myself." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I drove up to the property line around 2 this morning. Couldn't see much from the road, but there was definitely activity. Someone's living there." "And?" Tom prompted. "And nothing. It's his property now, legally purchased. If he wants to camp out in a ruin, that's his business." Patricia's tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as the gathered crowd. Mrs. Chen stopped praying long enough to fix the sheriff with a sharp look. "Some places should stay empty," she said in heavily accented English. "Some places remember." "Now, Mrs. Chen," Patricia began, but the elderly woman wasn't finished. "My grandmother told me stories about that land. Before the Blackwoods, before the valley was settled, the mountain tribes avoided it, called it place where earth dreams badly." She shook her head vigorously. Dreams should not be disturbed. An uncomfortable silence settled over the group. The valley's indigenous history was rarely discussed, but everyone knew the land had been inhabited long before European settlers arrived. The fact that even the original inhabitants had avoided the Blackwood property was not a comforting thought. "Well," Sheriff Kane said finally, "dreams or no dreams, I can't arrest a man for buying property and fixing it up. But I'll keep an eye on the situation." As the crowd began to disperse, each person casting final glances toward the mysterious lights in the distance, none of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line near the old mill. Elias stood motionless among the pines, close enough to have heard every word, his pale eyes reflecting an ancient patience that belonged to someone much older than he appeared to be. When the last person had departed, he smiled slightly and melted back into the shadows. The morning after Ezra's nocturnal activities, Margaret Chen stood at her kitchen window watching steam rise from her coffee cup as the sun painted the valley in shades of amber. She'd barely slept, her mind turning over the impossible sight she'd witnessed. The old Murphy place looked different even in daylight, not transformed exactly, but somehow more solid, as if the very air around it had thickened with purpose. Her phone buzzed against the granite countertop. "Margaret." Eleanor's voice carried the breathless quality of someone who'd been pacing since dawn. "Did you see the lights last night? Tell me you saw them too." "I saw them." Margaret kept watching the distant property through her binoculars. "What do you think he's doing up there?" "I think," Eleanor said carefully, "we need to pay our new neighbor a visit. Social call, welcome wagon." Margaret understood the subtext. In Millbrook Valley, curiosity wasn't just a personality trait, it was a survival mechanism. Too many strange things had happened over the years for residents to ignore new mysteries. An hour later, Margaret found herself walking beside Eleanor up the winding dirt road toward the Murphy place, a fresh apple pie balanced in her hands. The closer they got, the more unsettled she felt. The air itself seemed different here, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. "Look at the fence posts," Eleanor murmured, gesturing toward the property line. Margaret stopped walking. The old wooden posts that had stood crooked and weathered for decades now stood perfectly straight. Not replaced, she could see the same knots and grain patterns, but somehow renewed, as if years of rot and decay had simply decided to reverse themselves. They found Ezra behind the house, standing shirtless in the morning sun, with his hands pressed against the foundation stones. His dark hair gleamed with sweat, and Margaret could see the lean muscle definition across his shoulders and back. But what caught her attention wasn't his physique. It was the way the crumbling stone seemed to respond to his touch, hairline cracks sealing themselves as she watched. "Impossible," Eleanor breathed beside her. Ezra must have heard them, because he turned slowly, his unusual pale eyes reflecting the sunlight like mirrors. Instead of surprise or embarrassment at being caught, his expression held only a mild curiosity. "Mrs. Chen, Mrs. Hartwell." His voice carried that same musical quality Margaret remembered from the diner, as if each word had been carefully chosen for its precise weight and meaning. "I wasn't expecting visitors so early." "We brought pie," Margaret said, then felt foolish for stating the obvious. "Apple. Thought you might be hungry after?" She gestured vaguely at the house, at the inexplicably restored foundation, at the impossibility of what she'd just witnessed. Ezra stepped away from the wall and reached for a shirt draped over a nearby sawbuck. As he pulled it on, Margaret caught a glimpse of something that made her breath catch, symbols carved into his skin along his ribs, not tattoos but actual scarification, the marks raised and silver pale against his darker complexion. After working on the foundation, he finished for her, his tone neutral, Yes, I imagine I am hungry. Would you like to come inside? I can put on coffee. Eleanor and Margaret exchanged glances. The smart thing would be to make polite excuses and leave. The Murphy place had a reputation for good reason. Too many accidents, too many unexplained incidents, too many families driven away by forces they couldn't understand or control. But curiosity won, as it always did in Millbrook Valley. The interior of the house defied everything Margaret thought she knew about the property's condition. The floors gleamed with fresh polish. The walls showed no signs of the water damage and mold that had plagued previous occupants, and afternoon light streamed through windows that should have been cracked and filthy. "How?" Eleanor asked bluntly, settling onto a kitchen chair that looked handcrafted from local pine. "This place was condemned, Ezra. Structurally unsound. We all know what happened to the families who tried to live here." Ezra moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, measuring coffee grounds and water. "What happened to them?" "Accidents," Margaret said. "Strange ones. Tools that broke without reason, foundations that shifted overnight, wells that ran dry despite the water table. It's like the land itself rejected them." "And you think the same will happen to me?" There was something almost amused in Ezra's tone, but not mockery. More like the gentle humor of someone who knew a secret others hadn't discovered yet. "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "that you're not like the other families who tried to live here." Ezra poured coffee into 3 mismatched mugs, his movements graceful and deliberate. When he looked up, his pale eyes held depths that seemed far older than his apparent age. "No," he agreed quietly, "I'm not like them at all. The question is whether that frightens you or intrigues you." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames, except the sound wasn't quite right, more like whispered voices than moving air. The morning fog clung to the valley like a shroud, but even through the mist, Martha could see the impossible green sprawling across what had been the Blackwood property. She'd lived in Cedar Hollow for 63 years, had watched that cursed land claim 3 families and drive away countless others, yet here she stood at her kitchen window, coffee growing cold in her hands, staring at what looked like a miracle. "Tom," she called to her husband, who was shuffling through the morning paper at their kitchen table. "You need to see this." Tom's arthritic joints protested as he rose, but the complaint died on his lips when he joined her at the window. Where weeds and thorns had choked the life from everything for decades, neat rows of vegetables stretched toward the tree line. Even more unsettling, the ancient oak that had been split by lightning and left to rot was now somehow whole again, its branches heavy with leaves that shouldn't exist in October. "That's not natural," Tom whispered, his voice carrying the tremor of a man whose understanding of the world had just been shaken. 3 houses down, Sarah Chen was having the same revelation as she prepared for her morning jog. The running path she'd taken every day for 5 years skirted the edge of the Blackwood property, and she'd grown accustomed to the oppressive feeling that settled over her whenever she passed those rusted gates. Today, something had changed. The very air felt lighter, cleaner, as if a poison had been drawn from the earth itself. She found herself deviating from her usual route, drawn toward the transformation like a moth to flame. The closer she got, the more her rational mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The soil that had refused to nurture anything for as long as anyone could remember was now rich and dark, practically humming with life. Tomatoes hung heavy on carefully tended vines, and pumpkins dotted the fields like orange gems, scattered by some benevolent giant. But it was the house that truly defied explanation. The Blackwood mansion had been a monument to decay, its Victorian grandeur twisted into something grotesque by decades of neglect. Broken windows had stared out like dead eyes, and the wraparound porch had sagged under the weight of its own despair. Now, fresh paint gleamed white in the morning sun, and the windows sparkled as if they'd been crafted from crystal rather than glass. The porch, which Sarah could have sworn was rotted beyond repair, stretched elegantly around the building's perimeter, complete with hanging baskets, overflowing with flowers that had no business blooming this late in the season. She wasn't the only one drawn to investigate. As the fog lifted, other residents began to emerge from their homes, pulled by the same inexplicable magnetism that had captured Sarah. They gathered in small clusters along the road, speaking in hushed tones as they tried to reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew to be true. "It's been less than 2 weeks," Bill Henderson muttered, running his weathered hands through his grey hair. "You can't transform 40 acres of dead ground in 2 weeks. Hell, you can't even get permits that fast." "Maybe he had a crew working at night," suggested Elena Vasquez, though her voice carried no conviction. "Heavy machinery, lots of workers." "We would have heard something," Sarah interjected. "My bedroom window faces that direction. There's been no noise, no lights, nothing." The group fell silent, each lost in their own attempts to rationalize the impossible. It was young Marcus Webb who finally voiced what they were all thinking. What if it's not about the work he's done? What if it's about him? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. They all remembered the stories their grandparents had told, whispered tales of why the Blackwood property had remained cursed for so long. Some said it was built on desecrated ground. Others claimed the original owner had made a deal with something that shouldn't be dealt with. But there were older stories too, legends about people who could heal the earth itself, who carried in their blood the power to make barren lands bloom. "That's nonsense," Tom said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "There has to be a logical explanation." Elias Thorne had appeared in their valley like a storm cloud on a clear day, unexpected and potentially dangerous. But as they watched him move through his transformed domain, the residents of Cedar Hollow began to wonder if they'd misjudged the nature of the storm. Perhaps he hadn't come to destroy their quiet community. Perhaps he'd come to save it from something they didn't even know was hunting them. The morning air carried an unusual stillness as Elena walked the familiar path to the Thornwick property, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp dawn light. 3 weeks had passed since her last visit, and the transformation she witnessed then had haunted her dreams. Today, she brought Dr. Margaret Hale, the county's soil specialist, though she hadn't told the older woman exactly what to expect. "I still don't understand why this couldn't wait until a reasonable hour," Margaret grumbled, adjusting her equipment bag. "And why all the secrecy? You said there were unusual soil conditions, but—" Margaret's complaint died mid-sentence as they crested the small hill. Below them, the Thornwick lands stretched out like something from a fairy tale. Where barren, poisoned earth had festered for decades, now rows of vibrant crops swayed gently in the breeze. The soil itself seemed to glow with health, rich and dark as chocolate. "This is impossible," Margaret whispered, dropping her bag. She pulled out a pair of binoculars, scanning the fields with scientific intensity. "The contamination reports I reviewed last month showed this land was beyond redemption. Heavy metals, chemical pollutants, pH levels that would kill anything except the hardiest weeds." Elena nodded grimly. "Take your samples, Margaret. Tell me what you find." They made their way down the slope, Margaret stopping every few feet to examine plants and soil with growing bewilderment. Near the old farmhouse, now somehow restored to its former glory with fresh paint and new windows, they encountered Kai. He emerged from between the crop rows carrying a basket of vegetables that seemed almost luminescent with vitality. When he saw them, his expression shifted subtly, becoming more guarded. "Dr. Hale," he said, somehow knowing her name without introduction. "You're here about the soil." "Young man," Margaret said, regaining her professional composure, "I need to understand what methods you've used here. What fertilizers, what amendments, what restoration techniques. This level of remediation should take decades, not months." Kai set down his basket and studied both women carefully. Elena noticed his eyes held that same otherworldly quality she'd observed before, as if he was seeing more than what stood before him. "The land remembers what it used to be," he said finally. "Sometimes it just needs help remembering." "That's not an answer," Margaret pressed. "I need specifics. Chemical compositions, treatment schedules, source materials. The mountains provide what's needed." Elena watched this exchange with growing unease. She'd hoped Margaret's expertise might provide rational explanations, but Kai's responses only deepened the mystery. Behind him, the farmhouse seemed to shimmer slightly in the morning light, as if it existed in two realities simultaneously. Margaret knelt and began taking soil samples with practiced efficiency. As her instruments touched the earth, Elena could have sworn she saw a brief flicker of something, light, energy, she couldn't be sure, pass between Kai and the ground itself. "The mineral content here is extraordinary," Margaret murmured, reading her portable analyzer. "Trace elements I've never seen in this region. The soil structure is perfect. It's like it's been evolving for centuries instead of healing for months. Some things can't be measured by instruments," Kai said quietly. Margaret looked up sharply. "Everything can be measured, young man. Science explains." She stopped, staring at her readings. "This can't be right. The molecular composition is shifting even as I watch." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Margaret, what does that mean?" "It means this soil is somehow alive in ways that shouldn't be possible. The organic compounds are reorganizing themselves, optimizing for plant growth in real time." Margaret's voice carried a note of awe mixed with fear. It's as if the earth itself is thinking. Kai picked up his basket. The old families who lived in this valley understood things that had been forgotten. The Thornwicks knew, before the fear took hold. "What did they know?" Elena asked. "That some places choose their guardians, that the land and its people are connected in ways your science hasn't learned to measure yet." Kai looked directly at Margaret. "Your instruments can tell you what is happening, Dr. Hale. They can't tell you why." Margaret stood, brushing soil from her knees with trembling hands. "I need to run more comprehensive tests, get samples to the university lab. This could revolutionize our understanding of soil science, of ecology itself." "You can try," Kai said gently. "But some knowledge resists being captured." As they prepared to leave, Elena turned back for one last look. Kai stood among his impossible crops, and for just a moment she could have sworn she saw the outline of other figures around him, shadowy forms that might have been the valley's first inhabitants, watching over this ancient compact between land and guardian. Margaret's equipment bag rattled as she hurried up the slope, muttering about peer reviews and controlled studies. But Elena knew with growing certainty that whatever was happening here lay beyond the reach of any laboratory. The real question was whether the town would accept the truth when it finally emerged from the shadows. The town meeting at Millfield's community centre hadn't seen this much attendance in decades. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of anxious residents, while others leaned against walls or peered through windows from outside. The air hummed with nervous energy and the kind of speculation that spreads through small communities like wildfire. Mayor Patricia Henley called for order, though her usual commanding presence seemed diminished. She'd aged visibly in the past month, dark circles under her eyes betraying sleepless nights. "We're here to discuss the situation at the old Blackwood property." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. Everyone had driven past the transformation, but seeing it discussed officially made it feel more real, more unsettling. "That boy's done something unnatural up there," declared Mrs. Morrison from the second row, her weathered hands gripping her purse. "3 generations of my family watched that land kill everything that tried to grow. Now it's green as Eden overnight." Tom Bradley stood up, his contractor's cap twisted nervously in his hands. "I was up there yesterday installing the last of his solar panels. The soil's different, rich, dark, like nothing I've ever seen, and the way plants grow—" He paused, searching for words. "It's not right. Nothing grows that fast." Dr. Sarah Chen had been quiet until now, but the scientist in her couldn't remain silent. There could be explanations. Soil amendments, specialized fertilizers, engineered growing conditions. "Then explain the water," interrupted Jake Martinez, the county's water inspector. "I tested his well last week after complaints about increased pressure in the valley's system. The mineral content is unlike anything in our geological surveys. It's as if the water table itself has changed." Elena Vasquez felt her chest tighten. She'd been having dreams about the mountain boy, Ezra, she'd learned his name, dreams filled with images she couldn't quite remember upon waking, something about roots growing deep, deeper than seemed possible, connecting things that shouldn't be connected. "Maybe we should ask him to explain himself," suggested Ben Murphy, though his voice lacked conviction. "Invite him down here, have him tell us what he's doing." The suggestion was met with uncomfortable silence. Several people shifted in their seats. "He came into my hardware store last week," said old Pete Harrison. "Polite enough, but when he touched the seed packets, I swear they started growing right there in his hands, tiny green shoots pushing through the paper." "That's impossible," Dr. Chen said, but her scientific skepticism was wavering. Elena stood up, surprising herself. "I've been researching the Blackwood family history." All eyes turned to her. "There are records going back to the 1800s of strange phenomena on that land. Unexplained crop failures, but also accounts of sudden abundance that ended as mysteriously as they began." She pulled out a folder of photocopied documents. In 1923, there was a summer when the Blackwood farm produced triple the yield of any other property in 3 counties. The local paper called it a miracle. Then winter came early, lasting until May, and nothing grew there again for 5 years. Mayor Henley leaned forward. "What are you suggesting, Elena?" "I'm suggesting the land has always been different. The question isn't what Ezra's doing, it's how he's doing it, and whether he can control it." Outside, thunder rolled across the valley despite the clear evening sky. Several people glanced nervously toward the windows. Father Miguel spoke up from the back. "I visited him last Sunday, wanted to welcome him to the community." The elderly priest's voice carried an unusual uncertainty. "He invited me in for tea. The house, it wasn't the same inside. The rooms were larger, the ceilings higher, and the garden—" He paused, crossing himself. "I've never seen vegetables that size, flowers that vibrant. It was beautiful, but also unnatural." Mrs. Morrison finished for him. "Perhaps," Father Miguel said quietly, "or perhaps natural, in a way we've forgotten." Dr. Chen's phone buzzed with a weather alert. She frowned at the screen. "The National Weather Service is showing some unusual readings. Barometric pressure, electromagnetic activity, all centered over the northern part of the valley." As if summoned by her words, the lights in the community center flickered. Once, twice, then steadied to a warmer glow than before. Tom Bradley stood up abruptly. "I need to check on something." He headed for the door, several others following. Through the windows they could see it, a subtle shimmer in the air above the mountain, like heat waves on a summer day, except the evening was cool. The aurora-like effect pulsed gently, casting an otherworldly light across the valley. Elena felt that familiar pull, the same one she'd experienced weeks ago when she'd first driven past the property. But now it was stronger, more insistent, as if something was calling to everyone in the valley simultaneously. "He's not just changing the land," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "He's changing all of us." The meeting dissolved as people filed outside to stare at the impossible light show above, each wondering what they'd gotten themselves into by simply living in the shadow of the mountain. The morning after the confrontation at the Blackwood place, Sarah found herself driving the winding mountain road toward Elena's cottage, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. The events of the previous night had shattered her understanding of reality, and she needed answers that only the town's unofficial keeper of secrets could provide. Elena was waiting for her on the wraparound porch, as if she'd sensed Sarah's approach. The elderly woman's silver hair caught the early sunlight, and her weathered hands cradled a steaming mug of something that smelled like pine and sage. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Elena said without preamble, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Something like that." Sarah settled into the worn wooden seat, accepting the second mug Elena offered. The liquid was bitter and warming, with an earthy undertone that seemed to calm her racing thoughts. "We need to talk about Marcus, about what he really is." Elena's knowing smile confirmed what Sarah had feared, that she wasn't going crazy, that what she'd witnessed was real. "I wondered when this day would come. Your grandfather always said you had the sight, even as a child. My grandfather. Sarah's voice cracked. What does he have to do with any of this? Thomas was one of the few who remembered the old ways, before the town decided it was easier to forget. Elena set down her mug and leaned forward. He knew about the families, about the gifts that run in certain bloodlines, about why some properties in this valley remain empty no matter how desperate people become for land. The pieces began clicking together in Sarah's mind, like a puzzle she'd been unconsciously solving for years. Her grandfather's strange warnings about certain houses, his insistence that she learn to listen with more than her ears, the way animals had always seemed drawn to him. The Blackwood property, Sarah whispered. It's not just cursed, is it? Cursed is what people say when they don't understand the truth. Elena stood and walked to the porch railing, gazing down at the valley spread below them. That land sits on one of the old crossing points, a place where the barriers between worlds grow thin. The Blackwoods weren't victims of some ancient curse. They were guardians. Sarah's coffee mug trembled in her hands. Guardians of what? The balance. There are things in this world that most people can't see, can't comprehend. The crossing points need someone strong enough to maintain the boundaries, to keep what should stay hidden from bleeding through. Elena turned back to face her. When the last of the Blackwoods died 30 years ago, that protection died with them. And Marcus? Marcus is what happens when the old bloodlines return to reclaim what was always theirs. Elena's eyes held a mixture of relief and apprehension. But he's not entirely human, Sarah. The mountain families, the real ones, they changed over the generations, adapted to serve their purpose. Marcus carries that legacy in his blood. Sarah thought of the way Marcus had moved the night before, faster than should have been possible. The strange luminescence she'd glimpsed in his eyes, the sensation that the very air around him hummed with barely contained energy. Is he dangerous? That depends on what you consider dangerous. He's powerful, certainly, but the real danger comes from those who would see the barriers fail entirely. Elena returned to her chair, her expression growing grave. There are others, Sarah. People who've known about the crossing points for generations and want to exploit them. They've been waiting for the protection to weaken enough for them to make their move. Councilman Burke. Elena nodded grimly. Among others. Your article about Marcus has stirred up more interest than you realize. There are forces moving now that have been dormant for decades. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. What am I supposed to do with this information? What your grandfather would have wanted you to do. What you've always done in your own way. Seek the truth and protect it. Elena reached over and placed a gnarled hand on Sarah's arm. Marcus will need allies in the days to come. The town council won't stop with simple intimidation, and there are others involved now who play by much darker rules. The sound of a car engine growing closer made both women look toward the road. A black sedan moved slowly up the mountain path, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. Elena's grip tightened on Sarah's arm. They found you faster than I expected. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Who are they? People who collect things that don't belong to them, Elena said, already rising from her chair. People who think they can control forces they don't understand. And they've just made this a much more dangerous game than it was yesterday. The sedan pulled into Elena's driveway and sat idling, its engine a low predatory purr in the mountain stillness. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like a living thing, reluctant to surrender to the pale dawn light filtering through the ancient oaks. Sarah pressed her face against the cold window of her pickup truck, watching the Blackwood property emerge from the grey veil like something from a dream or a nightmare, depending on your perspective. What she saw defied explanation. Where yesterday had stood a collection of rotting outbuildings and rusted farming equipment scattered across barren ground, now neat rows of what appeared to be freshly planted seedlings stretched toward the tree line. The old barn that had been missing half its roof stood whole again, its weathered wood somehow restored to a rich deep brown that seemed to glow in the morning light. "That's impossible," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. She'd driven past this property every day for the past 15 years on her way to work at the county planning office. She knew every broken fence post, every collapsed structure, every inch of the cursed land that had claimed 3 families over the decades. The transformation she was witnessing couldn't have happened overnight. It couldn't have happened at all, not without heavy machinery, construction crews, and months of work. Yet there it was. Sarah grabbed her phone and called Marcus Webb, the valley's unofficial historian and the only person who might have answers. He picked up on the second ring, sounding groggy. "Marcus, you need to get to the Blackwood place. Now." "Sarah, what time is it?" "Just get here. Something's wrong. Or right. I don't know anymore." 20 minutes later, Marcus's ancient Honda wheezed to a stop beside her truck. He climbed out slowly, his arthritis making every movement deliberate, but when he saw the property, he froze. "Sweet Mother of God," he breathed. They stood together in silence, watching smoke rise from the farmhouse chimney in a perfectly straight line. The windows, which had been boarded up for over a decade, now gleamed with warm yellow light. A vegetable garden that definitely hadn't existed yesterday sprawled beside the house, heavy with what looked like mature plants, despite the early spring season. "Marcus," Sarah said quietly, "tell me about the families. The real story, not the sanitized version everyone tells the tourists." The old man's face went pale. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I think our mysterious mountain man might not be as mysterious as we thought, and I think those families might not have just left town." Marcus pulled his jacket tighter around his thin frame. "The Blackwoods were the first, back in 1962. Harold Blackwood bought the land from the county for almost nothing. Should have been our first clue something was wrong with it. They lasted 3 years before they vanished. Left everything behind. Food still on the table, beds unmade, car in the driveway." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "And the others?" "The Hendersons in 78. Same story. Then the Kowalskis in 91. Marcus paused, seeming to wrestle with himself. "There were others too, earlier, before the county kept proper records." "What do you mean, earlier?" "My grandfather used to tell stories. Said the native tribes wouldn't hunt in this valley, called it the place where the earth remembers. Said white settlers tried to establish homesteads here in the 1800s, but they always disappeared. Always the same way. Everything left behind, no signs of struggle, no bodies ever found." As if summoned by their conversation, a figure emerged from the farmhouse. Even at a distance, Sarah could see it was Ethan, but something about him looked different. He moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost inhuman, and when he raised his hand in greeting, the gesture felt ancient, ritualistic. "He's seen us," Marcus whispered. Ethan began walking toward them, and with each step, Sarah felt an inexplicable urge to run. Not because he seemed threatening, quite the opposite. There was something profoundly peaceful about his approach, something that made her want to walk toward him, to surrender to whatever impossible force had transformed this cursed land overnight. "Sarah," Marcus grabbed her arm. "Look at the ground around him." She followed his gaze and gasped. Where Ethan walked, the early morning frost was melting, leaving behind patches of vibrant green grass that seemed to pulse with life. Wildflowers were actually blooming in his footsteps, impossible varieties that shouldn't exist in this climate, in this season, in this world. "We need to leave," Marcus said, but his voice sounded dreamy, distant. Sarah wanted to agree, knew they should climb back into their vehicles and drive away and pretend none of this was happening. Instead, she found herself opening the truck door and stepping out onto the road. Ethan was close enough now that she could see his eyes, and they held depths that seemed to contain centuries of secrets. When he smiled, it was with the patient warmth of someone who had been waiting a very long time for this moment. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying impossible harmonics that seemed to resonate with the very ground beneath their feet. "I was hoping you'd come." The town meeting at the old community center had drawn more people than Elena had seen in one place since the harvest festival 3 years ago. Every chair was occupied, with residents lined up against the walls and spilling out onto the front steps. The air thrummed with nervous energy and whispered conversations that died the moment Kyle walked through the front door. He moved with that same quiet confidence Elena had noticed from their first meeting, seemingly unbothered by the dozens of eyes tracking his every step. Behind him followed 3 figures she'd never seen before, 2 women and a man, all carrying themselves with an otherworldly grace that made the hair on Elena's arms stand up. "Well," Mayor Hendricks cleared his throat from behind the makeshift podium, "I suppose we should get started." "Before you do," Kyle's voice carried easily through the packed room without him raising it, "there are things you need to understand about what's been happening here." Mrs. Patterson, the librarian, clutched her handbag tighter. "We know what's been happening. That cursed land of yours is spreading its poison." "The Blackwood property has never been cursed," said one of the women who'd entered with Kyle. She was tall and elegant, with silver-streaked hair that seemed to catch light that wasn't there. It was protected. A ripple of confused murmurs swept through the crowd. "Protected from what?" demanded Tom Brewster, the hardware store owner. Kyle stepped forward, and Elena noticed how the floorboards didn't creak under his feet like they did for everyone else. "From something that's been sleeping beneath this valley for over 2 centuries. Something that fed on fear and despair until it grew strong enough to influence the living." "You're talking nonsense," Mayor Hendricks sputtered, but his face had gone pale. "Am I?" Kyle's gaze swept the room. "How many of you have lost family members to accidents that didn't quite make sense? How many have watched your children grow up and flee this place like their lives depended on it? How many nights have you lain awake feeling like something was watching you from the darkness?" The silence that followed was deafening. Elena felt her heart hammering against her ribs as memories surfaced. Her brother Danny's sudden decision to leave for college and never come back. Her father's unexplained night terrors in the months before his heart attack, the way shadows always seemed deeper in the valley than they should be. "The entity that took root here feeds on isolation and despair," the silver-haired woman continued. "It's been slowly draining the life from this community for generations, growing stronger while you grew fewer." "Then what's the Blackwood property got to do with it?" asked Sarah Chen from the back of the room. "My family built that house as a seal," Kyle replied. "The strange accidents, the unexplained deaths, they weren't caused by the property itself. They were the entity's attempts to keep anyone from living there, from maintaining the barriers my ancestors put in place." Elena stood up, her voice shaking slightly. "The night I helped you move in, I felt something. In the basement. It was like—" She struggled to find the words. "Like something huge and angry waking up." Kyle nodded grimly. "The seal had been broken for decades. When I began repairing it, the entity realized what was happening. That's why the attacks on the town have intensified." "Attacks?" Mayor Hendricks's voice cracked. "The unusual accidents, the sudden illnesses, the way your livestock have been acting. It's all connected. The entity is trying to generate enough fear and chaos to break free completely." Old Mr. Garrison, who'd been silent in the front row, suddenly spoke up. "My grandfather used to tell stories about the early settlers, said there were families who came here who weren't quite normal, said they were guardians of some kind." "Your grandfather was right," said the second woman, who had remained quiet until now. She was younger than the first, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold depths Elena couldn't fathom. "We've been watching over this valley for generations, but we needed someone inside the seal to repair it properly." "Someone like me," Kyle added. "Someone with enough of the old blood to handle the energies involved." "This is insane." Tom Brewster stood up abruptly. "You're asking us to believe in monsters and magic and—" His words were cut off as every light in the building flickered and died. In the sudden darkness, Elena heard a sound like wind rushing through tunnels deep underground, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Someone screamed. When the lights returned a moment later, frost covered the windows despite the warm evening outside, and a crack had appeared in the foundation wall, running from floor to ceiling. Kyle's voice was deadly serious in the stunned silence that followed. "It knows we're talking about it now. We're running out of time." Elena looked around the room at her neighbors' terrified faces and realized that everything she thought she knew about her hometown, about reality itself, was about to change forever. The morning after the confrontation at the Blackwood place, the entire valley seemed to hold its breath. Sarah hadn't slept, her mind churning over everything she'd witnessed, the way Elias had commanded those dark figures, the ancient words that had rolled off his tongue like a native language, the power that had radiated from him in waves. It all defied everything she thought she knew about the quiet man who'd bought the cursed property. She found herself walking toward his land again, drawn by questions that demanded answers. The mist clung lower today, wrapping around the transformed buildings like protective arms. As she approached the main house, she could hear voices, multiple voices, coming from within. Through the window, she glimpsed Elias seated at a long wooden table that definitely hadn't been there before, speaking with three people she didn't recognize. They were dressed in simple, earth-toned clothing, and something about their bearing reminded her of Elias himself, that same quiet intensity, that same sense of otherness. "Sarah." His voice came from behind her, causing her to spin around. Another Elias stood there, identical to the one inside, wearing the same knowing smile. "How are you?" she began, then stopped as understanding dawned. "You're not human, are you?" "That depends on how you define human," he said, gesturing for her to follow him away from the house. "My people and yours share more history than you might think, though the stories have been edited over the generations." They walked through what had once been an overgrown field but now resembled a carefully tended garden. Plants she didn't recognize grew in neat rows, their leaves shimmering with an otherworldly sheen. "The Blackwood family," she said, pieces clicking together in her mind. "They knew, didn't they? About you, about what this place really is." "Ezekiel Blackwood was the last of your people to understand the true nature of this valley," Elias confirmed. "He served as a guardian, maintaining the barriers between our realm and yours. When he died without an heir who could carry on the work, the boundaries began to weaken. That's why the land was cursed," Sarah realized. "It wasn't cursed at all. It was unguarded." "Precisely. And certain entities began to take notice." His expression darkened. "What you saw last night was just the beginning. They're testing the boundaries, looking for weaknesses." They paused beside a structure that looked like a greenhouse, though the glass seemed to ripple like water. Inside, Sarah could see more of those strange plants and what appeared to be books floating freely through the air. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "When I first came to see you, why the pretense? Would you have believed me? Would anyone in town have accepted the truth, that their valley sits at the convergence of multiple realities, that it's been protected for centuries by an agreement between our peoples?" Sarah thought about Tom Fletcher's hostility, about the fear in people's eyes when they looked toward the Blackwood place, about her own assumptions. "Probably not," she admitted. "The transformation you've witnessed isn't me imposing something foreign on this land," Elias continued. "It's me allowing it to return to what it always was beneath the surface. Every building I've constructed existed here long before your town was founded. I'm simply remembering them back into being." A chill ran down Sarah's spine as implications cascaded through her mind. "How long have your people been here?" "Long enough to watch mountains rise and rivers change course. Long enough to see your ancestors arrive and decide whether they were friends or threats." He turned to face her fully. "Most proved to be friends. In time, they built their community in harmony with what was already here, understanding that some boundaries should be respected. And now? Now that understanding has been forgotten. The stories have become folklore, the agreements have become superstitions, and the guardianship has lapsed." He gestured toward the town below. "Without the Blackwood family's protection, both our peoples are vulnerable to things that should remain locked away." Sarah felt the weight of knowledge settling on her shoulders. "Those things last night, they'll be back, won't they? They'll keep coming until the boundaries are properly restored. But that requires trust, cooperation, understanding between our communities. He studied her carefully. It requires people who can bridge the gap between what was and what is. You're asking me to help convince the town, she said. I'm asking you to help save it, all of it, your people and mine. He nodded toward the strange greenhouse. There are things stirring in the deep places, Sarah. Ancient hungers that have been sleeping for centuries. The disturbance caused by the weakened boundaries is waking them up. Before she could respond, a low rumble echoed across the valley. Not quite thunder, not quite an earthquake, but something that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. The mist around them suddenly grew thicker, and Sarah caught glimpses of shapes moving within it. Elias's expression grew grim. It seems we're running out of time for explanations, he said, extending his hand to her. Are you ready to see what your valley really is? The emergency town meeting convened at sunrise, the community center packed beyond capacity, with faces Ethan barely recognized, alongside the familiar ones that had grown to accept him. Mayor Henderson's usually steady hands trembled as he called for order, his voice carrying an undercurrent of barely controlled panic. We need answers, Henderson began, his eyes finding Ethan in the crowd. The State Environmental Agency received satellite images showing impossible changes to the Blackwood property. They're sending investigators tomorrow. A murmur rippled through the assembled crowd. Sarah Chen stepped forward, her reporter's instincts sharp despite the early hour. What kind of impossible changes? Dr. Morrison, who'd arrived with a stack of aerial photographs, spread them across the front table. Vegetation patterns that shouldn't exist, soil composition readings that defy explanation, and most concerning, radiation signatures that suggest something beneath the property is actively generating energy. Ethan felt the weight of every gaze in the room. Martha Rodriguez, his unexpected ally in recent weeks, gave him an encouraging nod, but others wore expressions ranging from suspicion to outright fear. The investigators will want to interview you extensively, Henderson continued, addressing Ethan directly. They'll want soil samples, property access, and explanations for how you've achieved what appears to be environmental rehabilitation that violates several laws of physics. What exactly are we talking about here? Interrupted Frank Morrison, the hardware store owner who'd sold Ethan countless supplies over the past months. I've seen the property. It looks good, better than good. What's the problem with that? Dr. Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. The problem, Frank, is that according to these readings, the heavy metal contamination that's plagued that land for decades has been completely neutralized. Not cleaned up, not contained, neutralized at a molecular level. The soil now shows mineral compositions that don't naturally occur in this geological region. Elena Vasquez, the librarian who'd become one of Ethan's most vocal supporters, stood slowly. Maybe we're approaching this wrong. Instead of focusing on what seems impossible, maybe we should be asking how this could benefit the entire valley. Benefit? Dr. Morrison's voice rose. Elena, if there's some kind of unknown technology or process at work, we need to understand it before... Before what? The voice came from the back of the room. Old Henrik Larsson, the valley's most senior resident, made his way forward with deliberate steps. Before we admit that maybe there are things in this world we don't understand yet, the room fell silent. Henrik's presence commanded respect, his family having lived in the valley for 4 generations. I've seen a lot of changes in my 87 years, Henrik continued, his weathered hands resting on his walking stick. I remember when my grandfather told stories about this land, stories about how it used to heal itself, how certain places had their own ways of setting things right. Sarah Chen pulled out her notebook. Henrik, are you saying there are historical precedents for what's happening at the Blackwood property? The old man's eyes found Ethan's across the crowded room. I'm saying that sometimes the land chooses who it wants to work with. And maybe, just maybe, it chose right this time. Mayor Henderson rubbed his temples. Henrik, I respect your perspective, but state investigators don't care about folklore. They care about environmental regulations and scientific explanations. If we can't provide both, then maybe it's time I told you what I've actually been doing up there. Ethan's voice cut through the growing tension like a blade. He stood slowly, feeling the weight of decision settle on his shoulders. Every conversation with his grandmother about timing and trust, every careful month of building relationships with these people had led to this moment. The truth is, there's something under the Blackwood property that's been dormant for a very long time. Something that responds to specific conditions, the right person, the right approach, the right timing. Dr. Morrison leaned forward intently. What kind of something? Ethan met his gaze steadily, the kind that could transform not just that property, but every contaminated site in this valley, possibly beyond. The silence stretched until Sarah Chen broke it. You're talking about some kind of remediation technology? I'm talking about partnering with systems that were here long before industrial contamination, systems that know how to restore balance given the right cooperation. Mayor Henderson's expression shifted from panic to cautious hope. Can you demonstrate this? Can you show the investigators something that will satisfy them while protecting whatever process you've discovered? Before Ethan could respond, Henrik Larsson chuckled softly. The boy's been showing us for months. We just haven't been paying attention to the right details. Elena nodded slowly. The way the air feels different near his property, how the wildlife has been returning. Even the water in Miller's Creek runs clearer now. Ethan looked around the room at faces that had become familiar, at people who'd chosen to trust him despite their fears and doubts. Tomorrow would bring investigators and questions and challenges he couldn't fully predict. But today, he had something more valuable than he'd expected when he first arrived in the valley. He had a community willing to listen. The fog rolled in heavier than usual that morning, blanketing the valley in an otherworldly silence that made every footstep echo strangely. Maya pressed herself against the weathered bark of an oak tree, watching the figures move through the mist toward Elias's property. She counted at least a dozen men, their faces grim and purposeful. Sheriff Bennett led the group, his hand resting on his holster with the easy confidence of a man who'd never questioned his authority. Behind him walked Thomas Hartwell and several other prominent townspeople, their whispered conversations carrying fragments that made Maya's blood run cold. Can't let this continue. Unnatural changes. Threatening our way of life. Maya had tried calling Elias 3 times that morning, but the phone rang endlessly into nothing. The electricity in the valley had been acting strange for weeks now, ever since the transformation of his land had accelerated beyond anything they'd thought possible. Streetlights flickered in patterns that seemed almost like Morse code. Electronics failed and repaired themselves without explanation. And through it all, that peculiar energy that seemed to pulse from the mountain itself had grown stronger. She slipped through the trees, staying parallel to the main road but hidden in the shadows, her grandmother's warnings echoed in her mind with new urgency. The old woman had been increasingly agitated lately, muttering about the awakening and those who would stop it. Maya had dismissed it as confusion, but now she wondered if her grandmother had seen this confrontation coming. The fog began to thin as she approached the property line, revealing a sight that stopped her dead in her tracks. Where once there had been careful gardens and restored buildings, the land now seemed to shimmer with an inner light. The plants grew in impossible formations, their colors more vivid than nature typically allowed. The very air seemed thicker here, charged with potential, and standing calmly in the center of it all was Elias. He appeared unchanged from the quiet, thoughtful man who'd first arrived in their valley months ago. But Maya could sense something different about him now. The way he held himself suggested depths of knowledge and power that made her both fascinated and afraid. Sheriff Bennett called out across the distance, his voice carrying an official authority that seemed almost absurd in this transformed landscape. "Elias Thorne, we need to have a conversation." "I've been expecting you," Elias replied, his voice somehow audible despite the distance and the strange acoustics of the place. He began walking toward them with measured steps. Maya crept closer, using the unnatural plant growth as cover. The vegetation here seemed aware of her presence, branches shifting slightly to create better hiding spots, leaves rustling in ways that suggested communication rather than mere wind. "What you've done to this land," Bennett continued, his confidence wavering slightly as he took in the full scope of the changes. "It's not natural. People are scared." "Fear of change is understandable," Elias said, now close enough that Maya could see his expression. He looked almost sad. "But what's happening here isn't something to be stopped. It's something that's been waiting a very long time to begin." Thomas Hartwell stepped forward, his businessman's pragmatism cutting through the tension. "We want to buy you out. Name your price. Take your whatever this is and leave our valley in peace." Elias smiled then, and Maya saw something in that expression that made her stomach clench with sudden understanding. This wasn't just about one man and his unusual property. This was about something much larger, something that had been building toward this moment for far longer than any of them realized. "You still don't understand," Elias said softly. "This isn't my land. It never was. I'm just the caretaker, helping it remember what it was always meant to become." The charged atmosphere suddenly intensified, and Maya felt her skin prickle with electricity. Around the confrontation, the transformed landscape began to pulse with brighter light, and she could swear she heard something like singing coming from deep within the earth itself. Sheriff Bennett's hand moved to his weapon, but as he did, every electronic device in the group began to malfunction simultaneously. Radios squealed with feedback, cell phones flickered and died, and the sheriff's flashlight began strobing in patterns that definitely weren't random. "The choice was always yours," Elias continued, his voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate from the ground beneath their feet. "Embrace the transformation and discover what this valley was always meant to be, or fight it and watch everything you think you know crumble away." Maya pressed herself closer to the earth, feeling the pulse of that deep energy through her palms. Her grandmother's stories suddenly made terrible, wonderful sense. The valley had never been cursed, it had been sleeping, and now something ancient and powerful was finally beginning to wake up. The confrontation was far from over, but Maya realized with crystalline clarity that whatever happened next would change their small community forever. The ground beneath Sarah's feet trembled as another section of the old mine collapsed somewhere in the darkness ahead. Dust billowed through the narrow passages, and she pressed her sleeve against her mouth, trying not to cough. Behind her, she could hear the search party's voices growing fainter as they spread through the tunnels, calling Marcus's name. She'd insisted on taking this section alone, drawn by an intuition she couldn't explain. The beam of her flashlight caught something metallic embedded in the tunnel wall, old mining equipment, rusted beyond recognition. But there was something else, something that made her pause. Symbols carved into the rock face, the same spiraling patterns she'd seen in Marcus's journal. "Marcus?" she called out, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Marcus, can you hear me?" A sound drifted back to her, not quite an echo, but something else, water dripping, and underneath that, the faint whisper of movement. She pressed forward, following a bend in the tunnel that seemed to descend deeper into the mountain. Her flashlight beam wavered as exhaustion crept into her arms. She'd been searching for hours, ever since the cave-in had separated Marcus from the rest of them during their investigation of the mine's connection to the town's water supply. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her flashlight illuminated what appeared to be a natural cathedral carved from living rock, its walls gleaming with mineral deposits that caught and reflected her light in impossible ways. But it wasn't the chamber itself that stopped her. It was what lay at its center. A pool of water, perfectly circular, its surface so still it might have been black glass. And beside it, slumped against a fallen boulder, was Marcus. "Marcus!" She rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow but steady. Blood matted his hair where falling rock had struck him, but he was alive. As her hands checked him for other injuries, his eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with her flashlight's reflection. "Sarah." His voice was hoarse, distant. "You found it." "Found what?" "Marcus, we need to get you out of here. The whole mind system is unstable." But he gripped her wrist with surprising strength, his gaze fixing on the pool behind her, the source. Everything the town's been built on, everything they've been hiding, it all comes from here. Sarah glanced back at the water. In the beam of her flashlight, she could see that it wasn't entirely still after all. Something moved beneath the surface, creating patterns of light and shadow that hurt to look at directly. "Marcus, you're hurt. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I ever have." He struggled to sit up, and she helped him, feeling the tremor in his muscles. "Sarah, this isn't just an underground spring. This is what they've been protecting, what they've been drawing from for generations." "They?" "The families, the ones who really run this town. They've known about this place since the beginning, known what it could do, the prosperity, the way certain people seem to age slower than they should, the way problems have a habit of disappearing. It all traces back to here." Another rumble shook the chamber, and small stones scattered from the ceiling above. Sarah's radio crackled with static, but she couldn't make out the words through the interference. "We have to go," she insisted, but Marcus was staring at the pool with an intensity that frightened her. "They've been using it," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken, "taking from it. But they've been taking too much for too long. That's why the water table is dropping, why the wells are going dry. This place is dying." The surface of the pool rippled, and Sarah could swear she heard something like music, a low harmonic resonance that seemed to come from the water itself. "How do you know all this?" Marcus turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her step back. Knowledge, ancient, terrible knowledge that no human should possess. "Because I've been here before," he said quietly. "Not in this life, but in the memories this place holds. When I touched the water, when I fell," he gestured weakly at his injured head, "I saw everything. Every person who's ever drunk from this spring, every secret it's witnessed, every bargain that's been made." The music grew louder, and Sarah realized it wasn't coming from the pool at all. It was coming from Marcus himself, as if he'd become a tuning fork resonating with whatever lay beneath that still, dark surface. "Sarah," he whispered, reaching for her hand, "I know why I was really drawn to this place, and I know what we have to do to save it." The chamber shuddered again, more violently this time, and somewhere above them, Sarah could hear her name being called through the growing chaos of the mine's collapse. The town hall had never seen such a crowd. Every seat was filled, with more people standing along the walls and spilling out into the corridors. The air thrummed with nervous energy as Mayor Harrison called for order, his gavel echoing like gunshots in the packed room. Elena sat in the front row beside Thomas, her notebook clutched in trembling hands. 3 days had passed since their discovery in the mountain cave, and the weight of what they'd learned pressed down on her like a physical force. The symbols, the ancient records, the truth about the valley's founding, it all pointed to something far more significant than anyone had imagined. "We've called this emergency session," Mayor Harrison began, his voice strained, "to address the recent developments regarding the Blackwood property and its new owner." His eyes found Thomas in the crowd, and Elena noticed the mayor's hands shake slightly as he adjusted his papers. Sheriff Martinez stood near the side door, his expression grim. Elena had watched him escort Dr. Reeves from his office that morning, the elderly historian's face pale with shock after viewing the photographs she and Thomas had brought back from the cave. Whatever the doctor had recognized in those ancient markings had shaken him to his core. "Thomas Blackwood," Mayor Harrison continued, "you've made some extraordinary claims about this valley's history, claims that, frankly, many of us find difficult to believe." Thomas rose slowly from his seat, and Elena felt the entire room hold its breath. In the 3 days since their return from the mountain, he'd changed again. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. His movements carried an ancient grace, and when he spoke, his voice resonated with harmonics that seemed to vibrate in the very walls. "I understand your skepticism," Thomas said, his words carrying clearly to every corner of the packed hall. "But the evidence speaks for itself. This valley wasn't settled by accident in 1847. It was chosen, protected, hidden away for a purpose that your ancestors swore to guard." Old Mrs. Chen leaned forward from her seat in the 3rd row, her weathered hands gripping her walking stick. "My great-grandmother told stories," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow audible to everyone. "Stories about the first families, about promises made and prices paid. We thought they were just fairy tales." Dr. Reeves cleared his throat from where he sat near the back, flanked by Sheriff Martinez. "The symbols in those photographs," he said, his academic composure cracking, "they match fragments I found in other locations, sites that predate European settlement by centuries. But the implications—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "What implications?" demanded Jim Foster, the hardware store owner. His face was flushed, and Elena could see the fear in his eyes. "What aren't you telling us?" Thomas moved to the center of the room, and as he did, Elena noticed something impossible. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to dim slightly, as if his presence was drawing energy from them. Several people gasped, and she heard whispered prayers from the back rows. "Your valley sits at the convergence of 3 ley lines," Thomas explained, his voice taking on that otherworldly quality Elena had heard before. "Ancient paths of power that crisscross the continent. The original inhabitants knew this. They built sacred sites here, maintained the balance. When disease and conflict drove them away, they didn't abandon this place. They entrusted it to newcomers who promised to continue their work." "That's impossible," Mayor Harrison sputtered, but his protest lacked conviction. Elena could see doubt creeping into his eyes, the same doubt she'd felt dissolving in the face of mounting evidence. "The Blackwood property," Thomas continued, "wasn't cursed by tragedy. It was designed as a focal point, a place where the convergence could be monitored and maintained. Each family that lived there was chosen, prepared. But something went wrong 50 years ago. The knowledge was lost, the traditions forgotten, the balance began to fail." Sarah Martinez, the sheriff's daughter, spoke up from near the door. "The accidents," she said slowly, "the crop failures, the strange weather patterns. They all started around that time." Thomas nodded gravely. "The land has been crying out for restoration. The property called to me because I carry the bloodline, not of your valley's founders, but of the people who came before, the people who first understood what this place truly is." The room erupted in voices, some shouting in disbelief, others asking frantic questions. But Elena found herself watching the faces around her, seeing recognition dawn in unexpected places. The elderly farmers who'd struggled with inexplicable soil problems, the meteorologist who'd documented the valley's unusual weather anomalies, the children who'd always claimed they could hear voices in the wind. Sheriff Martinez stepped forward, his hand raised for silence. When the crowd finally quieted, his voice was steady but haunted. "I've seen the evidence," he announced. "The cave paintings, the geological surveys, the historical records Dr. Reeves has uncovered. Whatever Thomas is telling us, it's not fantasy, it's our reality." Elena felt the words hanging in the air like electricity before a storm. Everything was about to change. The town hall had never held so many people at once, bodies pressed against every available space, voices rising in heated discussion as Marcus stood at the front, the ancient journal spread open before him. Sheriff Williams tried to maintain order, but the revelations of the past hour had shattered decades of carefully constructed beliefs. "You're telling us the Blackwood family has been protecting us for generations?" Helen Cartwright's voice cut through the murmur, her usual composure cracked. "That everything we've been told about that property is backwards?" Marcus nodded, his finger tracing the faded ink on the journal's pages. "The curse was never meant to harm anyone. It was a barrier, designed to keep something far worse contained. The accidents, the strange occurrences, they only happen when people tried to permanently settle there and disrupted the protective wards. Dr. Reeves pushed forward through the crowd. That's impossible. I've documented the medical anomalies myself, the psychological effects, the effects of people fighting against a force they didn't understand, Marcus interrupted gently. When Elena's great-great-grandfather established the protections, he knew future generations might not comprehend their purpose. The barriers were designed to discourage settlement, not cause genuine harm. But when people forced their way in with construction equipment, with intentions to drastically alter the land, the protections turned defensive, Elena finished, stepping up beside him. The crowd's attention shifted to her, many seeing her clearly for the first time. Without the shadows and mystery that had always surrounded her family, she looked surprisingly ordinary, and yet there was an undeniable strength in her bearing. Tom Bradley stood up from the back of the room. So what exactly were these protections keeping contained? You keep dancing around that part. Marcus exchanged a glance with Elena. They had debated how much to reveal, how much the town could handle. The valley sits on what you might call a thin place, a spot where the boundary between our world and elsewhere is particularly fragile. There are things that would love nothing more than to push through that boundary. The room erupted in skeptical murmurs, but Margaret Henley's voice rose above them all. I've lived here 73 years. My grandmother told stories about voices in the mountain caves, about things that moved in the shadows. We always called them folk tales. Stories have power, Elena said quietly. They preserve truth even when we forget why it matters. Your grandmother wasn't telling tales. She was passing down warnings. Sheriff Williams stepped forward, his hand unconsciously resting on his badge. Assuming all this is true, and I'm not saying I believe it yet, where does that leave us now? You said the protections are failing. Marcus turned to a map he had drawn on the makeshift easel, showing the property boundaries and the surrounding area. The barriers have been weakening for decades. My family, the Blackwoods, we've been the guardians for 4 generations, but the knowledge was incomplete. Each generation lost a little more understanding. When my grandfather died, he took crucial information with him. But you're here now, Dr. Reeves observed, his scientific mind clearly struggling with the supernatural implications. You've been working on the property for months. Have you been able to repair whatever's failing? To some extent, Marcus admitted. Elena and I have been working together to restore the original protections, but it's not a permanent solution. The old methods aren't enough anymore. The thin place has been expanding. A chill seemed to settle over the room. Outside, the late afternoon sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley floor. What kind of permanent solution are you talking about? Tom asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Elena stepped forward, pulling out a leather-bound book from her jacket. The original protections required the cooperation of the entire community, not just one family bearing the burden, but everyone understanding their role in maintaining the balance. You want us to become part of some mystical protection racket? Helen's voice dripped skepticism. I want you to understand that you already are, Elena replied firmly. Every person who lives in this valley, who calls this place home, who cares about its preservation, you're already connected to the land. We're simply asking you to do it consciously, with knowledge of what you're protecting. Marcus could see the struggle on their faces, the battle between rational disbelief and the growing recognition that too many strange pieces were finally clicking into place. The next few days will be critical, he continued. There's a celestial alignment coming that will put tremendous stress on the barriers, with or without your help. Elena and I will do everything we can to strengthen them. But the old records are clear. The strongest protections require the unified intent of the community. Sheriff Williams looked around the room, gauging the mood. And if we refuse? If we decide this is all elaborate nonsense? Marcus met his eyes steadily. Then you'll find out very soon whether we're telling the truth or not. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Outside, the shadows continued to lengthen, and somewhere in the distance, a sound like wind through empty spaces whispered across the valley. The town hall erupted in chaos as Marcus stood before the assembled crowd, his hands still glowing with the faint residual energy of the ancient ward he'd just activated. Outside, the cursed properties throughout the valley hummed with a new vitality, their malevolent auras dissipating like morning fog. "Impossible," whispered Dr. Helena Marsh, the town's historian, her weathered hands trembling as she clutched a leather-bound journal. "The old records, they speak of guardians, but we thought them mere legend." Sheriff Coleman pushed through the crowd, his hand instinctively resting on his weapon before he caught himself. "Son, you better start explaining what just happened out there." Half the town felt something shift, and the old Blackwood place just lit up like a Christmas tree. Marcus's eyes swept across the faces before him, some fearful, others curious, many openly hostile. He found Maya near the back, her expression a mixture of concern and determination that gave him strength. "The curse was never random," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall. "Every property that fell under its influence sits on a convergence point, places where the barrier between our world and something far older grows thin. My family has guarded these thresholds for generations." Old Tom Hartley, who'd lost 3 farms to the curse over his lifetime, stepped forward. "Guarded from what, boy? What's been lurking out there all these years?" Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of secrets his grandfather had carried to his grave. Entities that feed on human suffering, despair, and conflict. They've been slowly poisoning this valley, turning neighbor against neighbor, driving families apart, corrupting the land itself. Mayor Elizabeth Crenshaw, her political instincts warring with genuine bewilderment, raised her voice. "And you expect us to believe you're some kind of, what, supernatural sheriff?" "I expect you to believe the evidence of your own senses," Marcus replied, extending his hand. The air above his palm shimmered, and suddenly a small projection appeared, images of the valley as it had been decades ago, vibrant and prosperous before the darkness took hold. The crowd gasped as the projection shifted, showing tendrils of shadow seeping through cracks in reality, finding purchase in places of power, growing stronger with each family torn apart, each farm abandoned, each life destroyed. "My grandfather was the last guardian," Marcus continued, letting the images fade. "When he died without properly training a successor, the barriers began to fail. The curse you've all feared, it was just the beginning. These entities were building towards something much worse, a permanent foothold in our world." Dr. Marsh stepped closer, her scholarly fascination overcoming her shock. "The patterns, the way the curse spread. It wasn't random, was it? It was strategic. Every cursed property was chosen specifically," Marcus confirmed. "Together, they formed a ritual circle spanning the entire valley. If I hadn't acted tonight, by the next new moon, the barriers would have collapsed entirely." A young mother near the front clutched her child closer. "What about our families? The people we lost to the curse, are they?" "Gone," Marcus said gently. "I'm sorry, but their sacrifice wasn't meaningless. Their suffering fed the entities just enough to keep them satisfied while I prepared. If they had grown hungrier, more impatient..." Sheriff Coleman removed his hat, running his fingers through graying hair. "Why didn't you tell us? Why all the secrecy?" "Because guardians work alone," said a new voice from the doorway. Every head turned as an elderly woman entered, her silver hair braided with small bones and feathers. "And because this valley forgot its true history long ago." Marcus straightened, recognizing the newcomer, though they'd never met. "You're from the northern settlements." "Guardians' Council," she confirmed, her sharp eyes studying the crowd. "We felt the barriers restore themselves. Impressive work, young one, though your methods were unconventional." The woman's gaze shifted to encompass the entire assembly. "For 300 years, this valley has been protected by the blood of guardians, families who sacrificed everything to keep the darkness at bay while you lived your comfortable, ignorant lives." "Now wait just a minute," Mayor Crenshaw began. but the woman silenced her with a look. "The old ways are ending," she continued. "The barriers between worlds grow thin everywhere, not just here. Guardians can no longer work in isolation. Your community has been baptized by truth tonight. The question is, what will you do with it?" Marcus felt the weight of dozens of stares, the palpable tension as his neighbors grappled with revelations that shattered their understanding of reality. Maya stepped forward, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she'd witnessed. "We adapt, we learn, we help." One by one, others began nodding, tentatively at first, then with growing conviction. The transformation Marcus had wrought in the cursed properties was nothing compared to what was beginning to unfold in the hearts of the valley's people. The real change was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as the entire community gathered in the town square. Word had spread quickly after last night's revelation. The cursed Whitmore property had been transformed overnight into something impossible, something that defied everything they thought they knew about their world. Marcus stood before them, no longer the mysterious stranger who had arrived 6 months ago. The supernatural energy that had surrounded him was gone, replaced by something far more profound, the quiet confidence of a man who had completed an impossible task. "You deserve to know the truth," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "This valley has been dying for decades, and you've all felt it. The crops failing, the businesses struggling, the young people leaving and never coming back. You blamed it on economics, on changing times, but the real cause was something far older." Eleanor stepped forward from the crowd, her weathered face etched with concern. "The curse. You said the Whitmore place was just the beginning." Marcus nodded gravely. The curse wasn't confined to one property. It was spreading, slowly poisoning everything it touched. The Whitmore house was the epicenter, the place where it all began over a century ago when my ancestor, Thomas Whitmore, made a terrible mistake. He gestured toward the transformed property, where impossibly lush gardens now bloomed where dead earth had been just hours before. The house itself seemed to glow with warm golden light, as if lit from within by some benevolent force. "My family has carried the burden of fixing Thomas's mistake for generations. We've been guardians, protectors, searching for the key to breaking the curse permanently. That's why I came here, not just to buy property, but to heal it." Sarah Martinez raised her hand tentatively. "But how? What you've done? It's not possible." "The old ways aren't entirely lost," Marcus explained, his eyes distant with memory. "There are still those who remember, who carry the knowledge passed down through bloodlines and sacred trusts. My grandmother was one of them. She taught me that every curse has a cure, every darkness has a light to banish it, but the price is always personal." The crowd murmured uneasily. They had witnessed the impossible, but accepting it was another matter entirely. "What was the price?" asked David Chen, the bank manager, who had initially tried to talk Marcus out of the purchase. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of sacrifice. "Everything I was before I came here, the power that allowed me to see the curse, to understand it, to fight it, it's gone now, used up in the breaking. I'm as mortal as any of you now." He looked around at their faces, some skeptical, others awed, many simply confused. "But that's not the important part. What matters is that the land is healing. Within weeks, you'll see changes, real changes. The soil will be richer, the water cleaner. Businesses that have struggled for years will begin to thrive. Young people will want to stay, to build lives here. And you?" Eleanor's voice was soft, almost maternal. "What happens to you now?" Marcus smiled, and for the first time since he'd arrived, it was completely unguarded. "Now I get to discover what it means to be just Marcus, not the last guardian of an ancient responsibility. I'd like to stay, if you'll have me. This valley has become my home." The crowd began to disperse slowly, people clustering in small groups to discuss what they had witnessed. Some remained skeptical, but others were already looking toward the transformed Whitmore property with wonder and hope. As the square emptied, Eleanor approached Marcus. "That first day, when you came to my diner, I could tell you were carrying something heavy. I'm glad you've finally set it down." "So am I," Marcus replied, feeling the truth of it in his bones. For the first time in his life, the future was unwritten, full of ordinary possibilities and simple dreams. Sarah joined them, her reporter's instinct still active despite everything. "Will anyone believe this story when I write it?" "Does it matter?" Marcus asked gently. "The important thing is that it's over. The curse is broken, the land is healing, and this community has a future again." As they stood there in the warming morning light, the first green shoots could already be seen pushing up through the soil in the town square's flower beds, soil that had been barren for decades. The healing had begun, spreading outward from the Whitmore property like ripples in a pond. Marcus looked around the valley that had become his home, no longer seeing it through the lens of ancient responsibility, but with the simple appreciation of a man who had found his place in the world. The impossible had been achieved, the curse was broken, and life could finally begin again.